The other day, I was told that there was somebody in mainstream media who wanted to chat with me about new media and independent media, and I didn't want to do it, so I didn't do it. And usually, I mean, half of it is that I'm introverted, and so I don't like to talk to all that many people. Part of it's also that I'm a little lazy, and so I didn't really want to make time in my day for that, because I'm a very schedule-oriented kind of guy, very structured in my day. Very organized. But there was another reason why I didn't want to do it, is because I know the way these things work. And usually what happens is you talk to these people for an extended period of time, and then they pluck like 2 or 3 quotes out from what you said, and they use that to fit their narrative. Well, turns out it was exactly right. So the outlet I'm talking about is Axios, and they did an article. And the article is titled, Corporate Media Backlash Fuels Upstarts. Corporate Media Backlash Fuels Upstarts. So, you hear that, and so far so good. That's a relatively benign headline, right? I mean, that's how I feel about it. It seems like it's a relatively benign headline. However, let me give you some of this article, and then you'll see one of the reasons why I was very hesitant to get involved. So it starts like this. New media personalities have gained enormous traction over the past year by catering to individuals who feel disillusioned by the mainstream press. By the way, only 29% of the American people trust the media. So people who feel disillusioned by the mainstream press, it's a gargantuan majority of the population. They say, a convergence of trends over the past year has made it easier for writers to launch new entities that can rival mainstream outlets, and it's given these creators the freedom to criticize big media institutions. Okay, still, so far, so good. They sort of link the rise in new media to the pandemic a little bit, which I don't think is true, but whatever, nothing really hinges on that point. Then they bring up the point I just made. Trust in mainstream media is at a record low, and the remote nature of the pandemic, sped up by digital innovation, is making it much easier for creators to self-publish and distribute their work online. That's the pandemic point. Quote, people are hungry for information, just not the information that the corporate media is trained to give people, Saagar Enjeti, co-host of the new YouTube show Breaking Points, tells Axios. Okay, so then they go on to talk more about Breaking Points, and they bring up other independent new media outlets, some of them, outlets where it's just writers, some where it's people who do a show and they actually talk. Who did they reference in there? They reference like Matt Taibbi's one example, and I forget some of the others that they bring up. But then they go on, and at the end of the article, here's what you get. Of the top 50 political podcasts on Apple Podcasts today, about 60% come from personalities that don't work at mainstream news companies. Using new platforms to attack media companies may lead to continued polarization of audiences and the nation. Helen Lewis notes in The Atlantic. Most troubling, the trend could also lead to an increase in the perception that misinformation runs rampant and that audiences shouldn't trust anything they see in the news. So, do you understand what they're saying here? They're saying, hey, these new media platforms attack old media, and that's a problem because then it leads to continued polarization of the nation. Wait a second. Mainstream media leads to polarization of the nation. Have you seen Fox News? Have you seen MSNBC? Have you seen CNN? It's not new media that's increasing polarization. If anything, we're just pointing out the way that old media works and pointing out that they are polarizing people. But see, they're trying to drop hints like, I don't know, is this such a good idea? And then the next line really says it all. The trend could also lead to an increase in the perception that misinformation runs rampant and that audiences shouldn't trust anything they see in the news. An increase in the perception that misinformation runs rampant. So in other words, new media is saying, hey, there's a lot of misinformation in old media, and so you shouldn't really trust it. The reason why we can say that and the reason why it lands is because it is absolutely, positively, 100%, without a doubt, accurate. Accurate. Yeah, we point out misinformation all the time in old media. That's half of our job. But they're trying to say that, like, oh no, we're just increasing the perception of misinformation in old media. So in other words, they're blaming us, new media, for pointing out the facts instead of blaming the old media companies for actually getting stuff wrong and spreading misinformation. See, this is one of the reasons why I didn't want to talk to him. This is the last line. If necessity is the mother of invention, then corporate backlash is the mother of new media upstarts. See, they're making it sound like it's just a strategy on our part. You know, like, oh, they found an angle, and the angle is to beat up on the old institutions. But the new media people are going to increase polarization, and they're going to increase the perception that old media is spreading misinformation. It's not a perception. You guys are polarizing, and you guys are spreading misinformation. Now, listen, I do say, generally speaking, print outlets are an exception because they're so much better than the TV outlets. I believe that to my core. You know, a lot of the information that we get for this show comes from the print outlets because they do a half-decent job. But when it comes to CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, Fox Business, CNBC, the nightly news on the various, state affiliates, they do a terrible job. And it's amazing that people can't have that minimum level of objectivity and admit this. So every major war that we've gone to in the past few decades, the media was cheerleading it. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. And by the way, everybody who was wrong on those wars got promoted. Everybody who was against them got fired. Phil Donahue got fired. Jesse Ventura got fired. Bill Kristol is now a major pundit on all these various news outlets. I don't know if he has a contract with CNN or MSNBC. David Frum, same. A lot of these people failed up. They failed up. So don't tell me about the perception of misinformation. It is misinformation. How many stories did they get wrong on Russiagate? How many stories? So many were just totally fabricated. Remember the one where they were like Julian Assange met with Paul Manafort? It's total bullshit. And so many outlets covered it. And then if any of them happened to make a correction, it would be later on and sort of buried. There are so many examples of this. Even the way they covered Trump was totally non-substantive. It was incredibly political and polarized, but they would make a scandal out of every tweet, and they would ignore all of the real policy failures. How many times did you guys hear the story of Donald Trump taking $1 million from the predatory payday loan industry and then dropping all the lawsuits against them and dropping all the regulations against them? How many times did you hear that story? Not much, right? How many times did you hear the story of him gutting the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, a bureau that returned billions of dollars to defrauded Americans from big financial institutions? Didn't hear much about that, did you? But you did hear about the time that he said in his speech, the TPP is going to rape us, and they flipped out over the word rape. Or he said, called somebody a horse face or some shit, and they melted down for 3 days over that. So, in other words, they're making it seem like new media has an angle. This is taking pot shots at new media and taking pot shots at breaking points. Fact of the matter is, listen, yes, I'm not just a straight news person. I don't pretend to be just a straight news person. I give you guys some facts and I give you my opinion on it. But I'm open and I'm honest and I'm upfront with that. And I do my job to the best of my ability. And yes, I have an ideological lens, but I tell you what that ideological lens is. I tell you I'm basically either a social democrat or a libertarian socialist. I tell you these things. So I give you my bias up front. Mainstream media does not tell you their bias up front. They pretend like they're just calling balls and strikes. They pretend like they're objective. They pretend like they're neutral, but they all have opinions. And by the way, their opinions are not really thoughtful. So it's not that we found an angle and we are trying to just increase the perception that misinformation runs rampant. We're pointing out misinformation runs rampant. It absolutely runs rampant. For sure. And the idea that it's old media doesn't increase political polarization. Arguably, nothing has polarized Americans more than old media. How many people do you know in your life who are either Fox News oatmeal brains or MSNBC oatmeal brains? There's a lot of them. There's a lot of them, aren't there? I'm telling you. Of course they had to add the pot shots, man. And then, how many times have we shown you segments? Some NBC News segment was fear-mongering about the increase of extremism as a result of, politics on YouTube. And the segment just outright calls for censorship and deplatforming and banning, regulation of it. Brian Stelter just did a segment the other day effectively calling for the deplatforming or censoring of right-wing outlets and basically outlets he doesn't agree with. They think they're so high and mighty. Let me explain something to you guys. Just because old media has gigantic budgets and everybody looks all prim and proper on air doesn't mean that they're good at their job. In fact, they're terrible at their job. And this is why people have started searching out new stuff. And that's not to say that all new stuff is good. Of course not. But it's different, and there are a lot of good outlets in independent and new media. So anyway, there you have it. I will say that at least most of the article seems to be at least benign. Most of the article is at least benign, but then at the end you get the normal stuff from corporate media. But you know what? We should all expect it. And the reason we should expect it is effectively we're competition to these old media outlets. Even though I'm very upfront about the fact, I'm not just a straight news person. I give facts and opinions, news and opinions. But even given that fact, I do think that these guys feel like we're competition, especially an outlet like Breaking Points. Because, Saagar was like in the White House press room at one point, and then Crystal was originally with MSNBC, and then they were at The Hill, so they always had one foot in that official world, and so they're the first outlet that now is fully independent, truly independent, but they also have a little bit of that mainstream credibility, and they're popular. And so I do think that people are a little bit threatened by that, but again, most of this is benign. I just don't like those pot shots at the end. I really don't like it, because it is true that traditional media really feeds political polarization, absolutely feeds political polarization. And it is true that there's a lot of misinformation in old media. And therein lies the problem with all this censorship and deplatforming stuff too, is that the way it'll work. And they already do this. The YouTube algorithm props up authoritative sources. That's all those mainstream media outlets, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, so on and so forth. And they take the borderline content, that's me, and they push it down in the algorithm. So even if we get something exactly right and they get something exactly wrong, it makes no difference. Why? Because they have the billions of dollars and the professional look, and I'm just a guy in my own studio who makes fart noises with his mouth and jokes around. So on optics alone, they say this is legitimate, this is illegitimate. And obviously, I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's just. I don't think that makes any sense. And I think in a fair fight, me versus CNN, in terms of viewership, I think we would win easy. CNN used to get horrendous. They'd get like 800 views on a video before YouTube started pumping them out with the algorithm. So in an actual free marketplace where everything's fair and square, they don't do too well. But when they're propped up, yes, they could dust all of us. So, God damn it, man. Of course, they're going to take some pot shots, but, the good news is, at least when it comes to Breaking Points, they're doing phenomenally well, and I'm sure that'll continue.